Hello, I'm Rick O'Shea, and I'm the literary curator for this year's UCD Festival. I want to welcome you to this very special edition. This year's festival is called UCD Festival at Home and is a chance for the global UCD community to virtually come together in these unusual times and join us on your smartphone, smart TV, or laptop for this free event. We're also very happy to be expanding our digital and worldwide festival audience. Although the annual UCD Festival has had to move online this year, the inspiring, engaging, and informative activities of the regular festival remain. It's wonderful to have the global UCD community of students, alumni, future students, and friends join us for this virtual conversation and for the events at the UCD Festival at Home. Stay up to date on the full UCD Festival at Home program at ucd.ie/festival. I hope you enjoy.
Well, hello, everyone, and you're all very welcome. My name is Jonathan McCrea. I'm a broadcaster with Newstalk, and I'm very excited to be joining you for this next session where we're going to be imagining Belfield and the world in 2070 with Mark O'Connell, author of To Be a Machine, which won the Wellcome Prize, and his new book is called Notes from an Apocalypse. Mark, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. Glad to be here.
How you feeling? How you doing?
I'm good. I'm all right. Yeah. Slightly weird like everyone else, but, getting through it, whatever that means.
Yeah. It's almost become that sort of cliche of all the emails I'm getting are these, how are you doing in these strange and wonderful times? We've run out of ways to describe what it is that we're doing. Right. But there is a sort of this underlayer of sort of feeling of anxiety that we're all sort of having. And I suppose thinking about the future, it's a good analogy, isn't it? Because this is only one sort of flavor of anxiety that I think has been sort of growing over the past number of years. Is that something you've been feeling, this sort of worry about the future?
Yeah, like in a way, this is sort of like, you could look at it as sort of shipping coals to Newcastle for me, because I've been, thinking through various apocalyptic scenarios for the last sort of 3 years on and off. But at the same time, nothing that I considered or thought about for the book really had anything like the shape of what we're experiencing right now. But yeah, no, my book, Notes from an Apocalypse, is, it's about the apocalypse in one way, but it's also at a kind of more fundamental level about anxiety. It's about anxiety about the future and the sense of uncertainty around what's coming around the corner. And for me, the apocalypse as an idea is a really fascinating kind of way of sort of channeling that anxiety, because the apocalypse sort of historically and culturally always crops up as a kind of a myth or an idea at times of particular kind of instability, at times of this sort of rapid change, and at times when the future seems particularly kind of dark and unknowable, i.e. right now, I suppose.
Yeah. And like, I really enjoy those films. I don't know if you enjoyed when everything's, when 92% of the population of the world is dead, what's going to happen next? Like I enjoy that as a fantasy because it's an interesting thing to think about. We love thinking about, the end of everything. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we're so obsessed about the end rather than the present?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? That's in a way part of what I wanted to do with the book. Part of what interested me about it in the first place is that when I started writing it first, and people would ask me what I was working on after I'd finished To Be a Machine, I would sort of say, with a slight element of like irony, I would say, well, I'm writing about the end of the world. And I sort of lost count of the amount of people who said, oh, I love the end of the world. I love the apocalypse. And it's kind of like, I was sort of slightly taken aback by it. But also, on some level, the reason I was writing about this topic was because I share that sort of enthusiasm for the theme of the end of the world. And it, like, like you, I guess I've sort of had, I enjoy apocalyptic narratives as much as the next man. I think we all do in some way. I must have watched the film Children of Men dozens of times over the course of the time when I was writing this book. And in a way, writing it with an excuse to kind of indulge all these like apocalyptic fascinations. But I think there is something about like the idea of the end of the world and the imagination of like total catastrophe, of like complete annihilation of the species that is weirdly seductive, I think. And I tried to examine that a little bit in the book. And I think part of it is that, like, to go back to that sense of living in times of particular chaos and rapid change, and when we don't really feel like we understand anything about the present, let alone the future, this idea of the apocalypse kind of, it narrows things down. It sort of makes it makes our place in history suddenly clear and explicable. I mean, one of the kind of more interesting aspects of what we're going through at the moment is this sense that like all of reality is being narrowed down to one fine point. Like there's only one story. You open the newspaper, it's one story, reiterated in various different ways, various different facets of it. But there's one thing going on. And if you go out in the street, you know what everyone's talking about. Everyone's talking about the same thing. And in some ways, okay, we're all experiencing different versions of this problem, but it is the one problem. There is one kind of narrative going through the world right now. And there's something sort of compelling about that as an idea, and I think as a reality as well.
Yeah. I interviewed Blind Boy on stage, and he talked about this sort of existential anxiety of climate change. And for me, there's something, as you say, the word is seductive about wiping the slate clean. And you look around and everything just seems so soiled. And I don't know if it's from, growing up in the 90s where that consumerism was all around. But like the idea of something clean and new has always been, I've had to really fight against that, but, as I've become more aware of the environment. But the idea of new and clean things and throwing out the old was a very attractive idea to me. And I think I see that when you spoke to people about the apocalypse, is that what they were thinking about? Like just a starting again and giving nature a chance? Is that what they were thinking about? Or was it more, were they willing it on?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there's an element of desire mixed in with all the anxiety and fear that I'm talking about in the book. And I think that's what makes it so interesting, is that if you dig beneath the surface of, I start out in the book by looking at preppers, doomsday preppers, people who are, stockpiling canned goods and digging bunkers in sort of secure locations, and, in an American context, stocking up on guns and ammo and so on. And
what was the most extreme version of that you saw?
Well, I mean, it's all pretty extreme, to be honest. But, I looked into the area of sort of luxury survival bunkers, people who are sort of, big property developers who are building these sort of like really high-end luxury sort of facilities for people with a lot of money who are concerned about what's going to happen if there's something like a pandemic like we're experiencing now, or an asteroid hits, or nuclear exchange, or whatever. And they're all very concerned about the collapse of civilization, and civil unrest is a big thing.
Right.
So it's not so much that you're defending yourself or protecting yourself against the asteroid strike or the pandemic per se. It's the crazy, desperate people out there on the perimeter who you have to defend yourself against. So I saw a lot of that. But in all of it, I did see, to go back to your original question, I did see an element of wanting, an element of yearning for this to happen. And I think it's complicated. There are lots of different strands to this. But part of it, I think, is that the world now, and always, I mean, I don't want to be sort of jingoistic about the present, but the world now certainly seems particularly complicated and particularly sort of, individuals seem to have very little purchase on the world and how it's going. And I saw a lot of evidence of sort of white men of middle age who, previously would have been, particularly in American culture, at a sort of a level of cultural prestige that has fallen away from them. And the sort of patriarchal norms have been chipped away at over the last, couple of generations, due to sort of civil rights and feminism and so on. And there's a real, I think, desire, mostly unspoken, but occasionally you glimpse it in the open, a real desire to go back to what these people would consider a simpler time, where sort of norms of masculinity were respected. And so you have this sort of fantasy of civilization collapsing, of, people on the outside reverting to savagery, and you have this well-prepared, sort of rugged, individualistic man who has his ducks in a row, knows how to make a toilet from scratch if needs be, has all these kind of like, rugged outdoorsy skills and lots of guns to back them up if necessary. And that's a fantasy of, I think, a return to a kind of an idealized notion of masculinity to do with, the American kind of fantasy of history of like the, manifest destiny and the frontier and kind of, the expansion westward. All these ideas kind of from history sort of crop up into our imagination of the apocalypse. So I was interested in all of that stuff. And yeah, there's an element of desire in all of this, I think.
Yeah, I mean, George A. Romero's zombie films, they very much pitched the end of the world as it's not about the zombies. It was always human beings who were awful to each other in times where they should have cooperated. And I mean, it struck me as slightly pessimistic. And I'm wondering, do you, when you speak to these people, is that, it seems like that's what they imagine. They imagine people banging down their door saying, let us in, we want your food, and sort of a Mad Max sort of scenario? Pretty much.
And a lot of it is actually informed by, zombie movies and Mad Max, certainly all of these kind of like, very lurid imaginations of what an apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic moment might look like. All of these feed into people's kind of real world encounters with these ideas in their lives. But yeah, absolutely. The notion of like the sort of desperate masses outside as something that you need to protect yourself from. That's a big strand in a lot of this, whether you're talking about, doomsday preppers, whether you're talking about the kind of higher end luxury sort of apocalyptic real estate guys. I mean, the people who I talked to for this, I mean, one of the people I spent time with was this guy, Robert Fazzino, who's like a very successful former advertising executive. He pioneered the field of large inflatable advertising. So sort of gigantic pints of Guinness and sort of floating King Kongs, all that sort of thing. He also built the, I don't know if you remember the film Airplane, but the autopilot in that scene, which is like a blow-up doll. Built that blow-up doll. So he comes from a background of like, basically sort of advertising and sort of innovations in advertising. But at a certain point around the turn of this century, he hit on the idea of like, well, people are afraid about Y2K and all these various kind of pandemics and so on that are happening. Let's see if we can sort of provide for these fears and maybe stoke these fears along the way. And when I met him in this place in South Dakota where he bought this like huge dairy farm essentially, which was a former military munitions facility set up by the US Army and Air Force during the Second World War to sort of house bombs and live ammunition. And so there were all these like overground concrete reinforced metal shelters coming out of the landscape, which were built to house these munitions. And he bought this place very cheaply, and he's selling off these quite large sort of overground bunkers for people to convert to their own sort of specifications. And the idea is this would become a post-apocalyptic survival community. So something happens, it's a nuclear exchange, global pandemic, civil unrest on a mass scale, whatever it is, you get in your car, your private jet, or you get in a plane, you get to South Dakota, and there's a private army that sort of patrols the perimeter. And you've got almost a kind of a de facto hyper-militarized state that's protecting these people. But his sort of approach to selling this idea to me, and it was very interesting, like my kind of relationship with him when I was there was basically he was trying to sell me this idea. So he was trying to sell me apocalypse timeshare in a way, and so the whole exchange was like, him sort of stoking my fears, trying to find out. He had my number pretty early on. He knew that I was like this sort of lefty, liberal, European kind of intellectual type, and he kind of poked a little bit of fun at me. But he kind of I could sense that he was trying to find the things that I was afraid of and stoking those fears.
Right.
But the big thing for him and for these people is like, it's not so much the catastrophe itself, it's the effects of the catastrophe on society at large. And so what you're going to have is hungry, desperate people maybe resorting to cannibalism. He's big, a lot of these people are big on cannibalism. If you're president Alex Jones or any of these guys, that doesn't take much to sort of raise the specter of either oneself becoming a cannibal or other people becoming a cannibal. And I think it's interesting because all of this reverts back to the sort of mythology of the frontier, the Donner Gang and all this kind of stuff, or the Donner Party. And so the big sort of proximal fear is other people. It's sort of the savages outside the compound.
I think looking through recent American history, that's probably a reasonable bet. I think seeing how people behave to each other in times, obviously we're seeing a lot of goodwill, but supplies are still there. I think knock down internet in Dublin City, and we'd see the Omega Man pretty quickly.
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, I'm always conscious of talking about this. It's a slightly different tone when you talk about this to an American interviewer or to an American audience, because the sort of anti-government, anti-society sentiment is a bit closer to the surface in America. So it takes less for people to start reaching for their guns. They have guns in the first place, but it takes less for people to start being mistrustful, I think, in an American context. But I think, one of the things that's been interesting and sort of reassuring about this period that we're in now is that, I spent so long talking to people who are obsessed with apocalyptic scenarios and sort of scenarios of civilizational collapse, and reading through various kind of versions of the future that they had in mind. And all of these people, their sort of vision of the darkness of the future always seemed to be predicated on this notion that all it takes is a significant enough disaster. If it's, an electromagnetic pulse, a solar flare, whatever it is, the grid goes down, the internet drops out, no one's got Wi-Fi, all of a sudden you've got cannibals, within sort of 4 to 6 weeks, everyone's out for each other's flesh. And that's a real fear, that's a real anxiety among a certain subset of people. But I think what's interesting about that is that, we're now living through, it's by no means an apocalyptic scenario. It's a very difficult time that we're going through. But we're seeing something similar to what a lot of these people would have forecast as an inevitable kind of thing that's going to happen, I don't focus too much on pandemics in the book, but it was something that came up repeatedly along with other scenarios. But what's happening is, people aren't out there with pitchforks. No one's been looking to turn me into a rump steak or whatever so far, touch wood. Generally, I think what tends to happen in more sort of, in crisis situations is that people sort of pull together. Yeah. People generally act out of a sense of collective self-interest, with some exceptions, and those exceptions often get sort of magnified in media and social media and sort of casual conversation. But in general, I think people tend to pull together at times of crisis.
That's kind of interesting because, when we think about the shift in, obviously there were plenty of negative science fiction predictions about the future, but if we think about, the 50s and before then, there was this promise of technology to bring us into this modern world of leisure and plenty. And now when we look at almost any science fiction work, they don't show people pulling together en masse. They show absolute catastrophic breakdown, 1984 levels of people being really shitty to each other, but also system collapse and a proper, a human sort of apocalypse. And I'm wondering, what, is that something about, does the way we see the future right now, is that affected by by what's going on here? Because in the 50s, obviously, it was post-World War II. It was the era of Rock Hudson. It was a period of relative calm and peace. It was a simpler way of living. Now, everything seems so chaotic. And so our predictions of the future seem so grim. It's kind of, I'm trying to figure where did that come from?
Yeah, no, I think so at this point I've written 2 books that are at least ostensibly about the future. Even though I have no claim to expertise or even particular interest in like the future per se. I'm not a futurist. I don't have any kind of science background, but I am interested in what the future says about the present. And I think our imagination of the future always reflects right now and what's happening in the culture right now. So yeah, you're right. Like, back in the 50s, all through mid-century, the sort of imagination of what the future would look like was, broadly kind of informed by the sense of like post-war cultural optimism. Capitalism was booming transatlantically. There's a sense that technology could solve almost any problem. And, we were literally going to space. Like all of this stuff had happened incredibly quickly. So it stood to reason that our sort of imagination of the future was something like, Star Trek, to take a sort of a fairly culturally influential and highly optimistic sort of reading of the future. What's interesting to me is that, now that's sort of fallen away, with certain exceptions. But like when we talk about the future now, a sort of a darkness falls over the room, there's a kind of a shadow of the future. And I was very interested in that in writing this book. I mean, my first book, To Be a Machine, even though it's only out 3 years at this point, it seemed to me, even like by the time it came out, it seemed to me to be not a book about the future, or even at that point a book about the present. It seemed to be a book about the recent past, because it came out in like early 2017. It actually came out in the US the week that Donald Trump was inaugurated. And so it seemed at that time that like the culture had completely changed. And this, the book is about, it's about the transhumanist movement in Silicon Valley and people who believe that, it might be possible to live indefinitely through technology and to sort of expand the boundaries of the human condition and so on. But it was also at a sort of deeper level about the climate and culture of sort of radical technological optimism that was kind of in the ether at that time. This sense that like, technology can solve all problems and, there's an app for everything kind of thing. And it was sort of, as much as it was about this specific transhumanism movement, it was about that culture. And that seemed to me to have fallen away quite severely in the time after that book came out. And now I think when we think about the future, it's something very different. It's something much darker and more, uncertain. And so that's where the apocalypse kind of comes in as this sort of organizing principle for those uncertainties. And for me, it worked as a way of, like, the second book grew out of this moment of, for me, anxiety about the future as a parent of 2 very young children and just someone who's kind of, fairly aware of the world and what's going on out there, and the sense of like conflict between those 2 things, and not quite knowing what to do with that sense of conflict and feeling somewhat helpless about the future and so on. And so at that point, the idea of the apocalypse and people preparing for the apocalypse kind of came into view and gave me an organizing principle for the book in a way that reflected how the idea of the end of the world kind of organizes our anxieties as a culture. If that makes sense.
Yeah. One of the themes that seems to have been strong for quite some time, maybe at least 2 decades, is this Lobo core character. Large commerce, multi-international companies, .com giants and so on, and they take many forms. Obviously, in RoboCop, from RoboCop to Westworld, the role of corporates and these large companies seem to be pretty big in bringing about sort of a very unpleasant future. Is that something that you get a sense is of people's fear of the future in terms of when we talk about apocalypse, we tend to think of people with shotguns on the back of pickup trucks, but we don't often think about just complete inequity of wealth and poverty and large that to me sounds like the apocalypse, and that role of the corporation seems to have been a major part and is a major part of sci-fi today. What does that say about what we think about the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you should mention RoboCop. That was definitely a movie that I saw at a very young and influential age. That, if I was looking for a sort of a psychoanalytic explanation for why I've gone down the road I've gone down, that might be in there somewhere. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, so the book, Notes from Apocalypse, it starts with, it dwells briefly on the sort of spectacle of, people in pickup trucks, the Mad Max sort of vision of the future. But really the apocalypse that I'm most interested in and that I focus on for much of the rest of the book is that sort of, like, to use your term, sort of global core vision of the future, and people making money out of apocalyptic anxieties. And also the sense that, certain people have of, there's this sort of cliche at this point, but this idea that, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I try and sort of look a bit harder at that idea and try and figure out what that might mean. And there's just lots of stuff in the book about, people looking forward to a sort of an apocalyptic break where you've got like the collapse of global democracies and all these kinds of things, and how that might in some ways benefit capitalism. I mean, one of the people who I look at in both books, but particularly in Notes from an Apocalypse, is Peter Thiel, who's the former PayPal founder and colleague of Elon Musk's, who's, he's kind of a recurring antagonist, I suppose, throughout my work, sort of from an ideological point of view. He is someone I look at in the chapter on New Zealand in the book, and Thiel is sort of, among the many things that he's notorious for, including investing in like eternal life technologies and sort of speculating about the value of, blood transfusions from young people to keep himself young and so on. One of the things that he's sort of notorious for is speculating about the collapse of democracy and talking about how democracy and capitalism might no longer be compatible. I think it's pretty clear which side of that divide he would sort of fall on. But he has, he bought a fairly large tract of land in the South Island of New Zealand, ostensibly to sort of build a post-apocalyptic compound. And I sort of like went down there and had a look at this place and talked to people in New Zealand about what his, relationship to New Zealand meant to them and what it meant to New Zealand generally, and what his vision of the future looked like. And it's, not to go into too much detail, but it's sort of much closer to this sort of global core post sort of dystopian kind of, hyper-capitalist vision of the future than any of those sort of Mad Max, every man for himself visions.
Yeah. What about the transhumanists you talk about in To Be a Machine? They seem like people who are trying to bring the future forward. And it seems a lot of their thought is influenced heavily by science fiction. And then, of course, we know that actually science fact is also influenced by science fiction. The scientists who watch Star Trek end up, creating Star Trek type gadgets, or looking at that sort of science. And many there seems to be this feedback loop between those. These transhumanists, what were they trying to achieve by pursuing this man-machine merge? And maybe you might tell us some of the stories of those people who were trying to bring, what we imagine to be 50 years away, cyborgs to. Yeah.
I mean, these are people who have a very intimate and optimistic relationship with their idea of the future. I mean, they're living for the future in a way almost that, you might speak of an evangelical Christian as living for the afterlife, or, living for the, resurrection or whatever. They're living for the singularity, for want of a better term, which is this idea that, at a certain point in the, near to medium future, artificial intelligence and various other kinds of technologies are going to get so sophisticated and so powerful that we're going to merge with technology and become sort of something other than human, become these kind of superhuman, immortal, sort of godlike creatures. So I talk to a lot of people, unsurprisingly, mainly kind of centered around Silicon Valley and environs around there, who are very invested in this idea of the future, and are in various ways working towards it. Whether, I spoke to people who were involved in AI. I spoke to people who were involved in radical life extension research. One of the people I spent time with was like a sort of a would-be politician, a guy who was running for US president on the platform of like creating awareness around essentially the problem of death, because these people see death itself as a problem to be solved through technology. But they are very much invested in this idea of like a grand sort of break with the history of what it meant to be human coming quite soon. And yeah, as you say, they're all, they all have different ideas about the future, and they're all sort of different kinds of people working towards different sorts of things. But one of the things that most of them had in common was, as you kind of flagged there, this interest in science fiction. And so many of these ideas come from fiction in the first place. So that idea that you sort of mentioned in the feedback loop, that's something that really interests me in the book. And to a certain extent in the Apocalypse book as well. This idea that like the way that we read reality and the way that we imagine our own reality in the future often comes directly out of fiction and employs the sort of like tropes of fiction and so on. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of people sort of working to bring about things that they would, things that they would have read about in, again, mid-20th century kind of science fiction, people like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and these kinds of people.
Yeah. If we kind of think about what they're thinking about and what we have around us in terms of new ideas, AI, cars that don't need drivers, vertical farms, and so on. If I dare to ask you, because I think it's say 50 years away from now is very safe to start predicting on, because nobody knows. So you can say whatever you want. And I think, you were saying, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a futurist. I was saying those two things don't always overlap, as you know. A lot of futurists tend to just speak with confidence about things that we can never really predict. But if I were to ask you to wear the hat of a futurist for the rest of this, and maybe imagine what you imagine 2070 might look like in terms of work, in terms of play, in terms of society, what do you think we might look like then?
Well, I mean, my futurist hat is very small, and it's like a little comedy sort of clown hat. So don't take it with a grain of salt. But if I'm going to be optimistic about it, I would like to think that we will have had to given up our addiction to carbon and to petroleum. And I think that's going to be like a radical change on every level of society. I think it's like to sort of give you I'm not great on we're going to have jetpacks or sort of hoverboards or whatever. People predicting the sort of future of technology is a bit of a mug's game anyway. Although I'll be dead in 50 years' time, probably, or so old that I won't care that I was wrong, so maybe I should just go for it. But I think it's either radical change, or it's either radical change for the better, or radical change for the worse. I think if we don't break our addiction to consumption and mass production and just this voracious consumption of carbon, I think the radical change is going to happen anyway, but it's going to happen in ways that we can't control. To be pessimistic about it, it may already be getting too late, who knows? But these are the things that have to happen, I think, for the future not to be the sort of dark and bleak and unlivable place that so many of the people, including myself at times, are imagining in Notes from an Apocalypse.
Yeah.
The apocalypse in the book that I write about, I mean, there are various versions of the end of the world, but the apocalypse that I'm kind of most concerned with as the book goes on is capitalism. It's the way things are right now.
Yeah, George Monbiot wrote that piece in The Guardian where he kind of said you can have either growth or you can have capitalism, but you can't have both. And I think everybody, we need to be hopeful because if we're not hopeful, then things will get worse, right? But I have this, this dark part of my soul that says things are not going to get worse. They're going to get much, much, much worse. And that we can't grow and we can't, we can invest in these technologies, but we need to consume less. And for a government, it's important to have that message of, we can keep growing, we can get more jobs, we can have more enterprise, and at the same time we can also reduce our emissions, we can have cleaner air and so on. There's a vested interest there, and for me, I feel very uneasy with that. And I don't know how you feel like that.
Yeah, well, for me, I mean, I guess
growing and do it.
Say that again. Sorry, that last.
That we can't keep growing and also fix this pressing climate change problem.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think like the notion of sustainable growth or whatever, it seems to be almost a contradiction in terms, because the problem is we have this like irrational system that is predicated on like perpetual growth. Even small amounts of shrinkage are a cause of panic and, massive job loss and sort of unsustainable levels of chaos. So I think we probably, I'm not an economist any more than I'm a scientist, but it seems to me that we need a less irrational sort of like jittery system. But I think like at the same time, you need like, it's not just a question of like changing our attitudes and changing how we consume and changing how we think about the future. It's, as with everything, it's a question of power and who holds power. And I think, people talk about this in relation to the current situation with the coronavirus, and that, things will never be the same again, and people will want different things coming out of this crisis and so on. And I think a lot of that is true, but it's also like really important to recognize that nothing changes if the people in power don't want things to change. And it's not just a matter of kind of like us having this sort of mind shift moment. It's very much a question of who holds power and what they do with it. And so if you have, if you continue to have these like, right-wing governments, as, we have in like some of the most powerful countries in the world, and, sort of neoliberal kind of thinking about, economies and so on, not much is likely to change, I think. So it's, it's easy to get, sort of pessimistic about these things, because these are really hard things to accomplish, changing how power is wielded in the first place and the ends that it's wielded for, and then like doing productive things with that. It's all a big job, and it's beyond the capacity of someone like me to say how it might be done.
In the two books, as you say, you do talk about these people who do wield that sort of power, Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, for example. Do you think the fate of the world rests quite a lot on Bezos, people like, Buffett, Gates, these people who have huge influence and huge power? Do you think that the way the world topples one way or the other depends very much on these single individuals?
The power that these people wield is like absolutely disproportionate and like completely anathema to any kind of just or sustainable society, I think. But it's not like necessarily the fault of the billionaires. It's not as though like the billionaires themselves have that we need to rely on them to do or not do certain things. I think it's the system that allows the existence of this level of wealth and subsequently sort of power flowing from that wealth. That's the problem. There will always, as long as we have systems that allow it, there will always be, multi-billionaires. There will always be Peter Thiel's, and there will always be, Jeff Bezos's, and that's a problem. I think we can't go on like this. And I think, not to kind of contradict my previous sort of statement about sort of, mind shifts versus like actual, structural questions of power. But I think people are becoming increasingly aware that this is wrong, that, the existence of someone like Jeff Bezos with his level of wealth and power, as against, what he's actually contributing materially to society and to his own workers and so on. I think people are increasingly realizing that this is not cool,
Let's then end, I suppose, on an idea of positivity. One of the things that you said we've seen from this pandemic is a sense of growing a community and people wanting to do the right thing. And it seems to me very much that the younger generation really want a purpose and want a meaning to their work beyond creating wealth and capital. And that to me is a very positive sign, that the young people of today seem to want to contribute to society at large. And maybe that might be something.
Yeah, I think so. It's sort of like, it's a double-edged sword, because there's so much desperation at the moment, and there's so much like the sense that younger people have of the future is radically different to what it was, you know, in the 80s and in the 90s, and sort of the Celtic Tiger era here, and the sort of like, you know, the idea of the end of history that we had at the sort of turn of the last millennium. It's a very different sort of mood, very different kind of milieu now. And there's a sense of like the stakes have never been higher, you know. It's either radical change, as I said, it's like either radical change or, you know, complete darkness and, you know, an unthinkable future. So it's, you know, what do people have to lose, you know? And I think that's probably a good place to start from if you're looking to change things.
Yeah. What have you got to lose? You might as well change the world, yeah.
It's got very revolutionary, actually. I wasn't expecting it to go in that.
Nice.
Wouldn't happen on Newstalk, I don't think, would it?
You never know. Yeah, it depends on what time you're listening.
Maybe on a weekend, yeah.
Exactly. Well, we'll leave it there. Mark O'Connell's book, Notes from an Apocalypse, is in shops now. Mark, thanks very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.